Originally said 1 million seeds, and then after I was now 2. And so by the end of the 1800s, or the 1800s in Canada was in many ways the golden age of cannabis in Canada, with hemp mills operating all across the country and cannabis medicines very widespread. But by the end of the century and the beginning of the 1900s, things became quite difficult for cannabis and the cannabis culture in Canada. Part of that was just a technological change. The introduction of the steam engine meant that boats didn't need as many sails, and so the demand for those strong hemp fibers was diminished. There was also the invention of the cotton gin at that time that allowed cotton fibers to be processed with much less labor, and so although cannabis was still being grown, it was mostly a specialty crop when you really needed those strong fibers, but otherwise it wasn't so popular. And in the early 1900s, we also saw the beginning of Canada's war on drugs. There were thousands of unemployed single Chinese men, and the white folks there, the white unions there, would have rallies and say they were taking their jobs. And the reason there was these Chinese men there was because they had come to work on the railways, they'd come to work in the gold mines, they'd been lured to Canada with promises they were going to get rich quick. And for the most part, they preferred using opium to alcohol. Partly that was a wise choice on their part, because opium's an incredible pain reliever, and these guys would have had back-breaking, difficult, long days and a lot of labor, and they would have needed something like that to help them ease the pain of those jobs. And also a common ailment at the time was dysentery. And dysentery is basically diarrhea that kills you. And opium's a treatment for that and helps stop your dysentery, stop your diarrhea from being so severe. So it was a folk medicine and a pain reliever and commonly used. And one of the reasons the Chinese also used opium was because a few decades earlier, Britain had gone to war with China. Britain was addicted to a Chinese drug, tea, and they were importing it, and all the Chinese wanted back was silver, and Britain was going bankrupt with their addiction to tea. So Britain had decided the way to redress this imbalance was they controlled India. They would take Indian opium, sell that to the Chinese, and that would be a way of balancing things out. China had banned opium, which just helped the smugglers make more money like it does today. The British cashed in. They had much better boats and much better military than China. They actually went to war with China twice in the Opium Wars to force China to take British opium, which eventually they did. And so now, a few decades later, in BC, we've got these Chinese men who are using opium, who have come here to work and are now willing to work for lower wages and perhaps work harder than the white folks that are there. And so there's groups like the Chinese Exclusion League and the Anti-Asian League and other groups that are specifically formed to hate on the Chinese folks. And they would have rallies downtown in Vancouver on Hastings and Main Street, and they'd go charging into Chinatown. They'd beat people up and throw bricks through windows and smash stuff. And there was a very big one of those in 1908, and the federal government wanted to make reparations to the Chinese who had had their businesses damaged. And so they sent in the Minister of Labor, a guy named William Lyon Mackenzie King, who later became Prime Minister of Canada. Among other things, he was known for using a Ouija board to talk to his dead dog and his dead mother to get political and personal advice. So who is he to judge anybody else, right? But he was sent to Vancouver to make reparations, and he figured the best way to solve the problem was to get rid of these Chinese people, and the best way to do that was to ban opium. And so he wrote a report on the need to suppress opium traffic in Canada. Within a few months, Canada's first anti-opium law was passed, and within the first year, they were deporting hundreds of Chinese people and imprisoning large numbers as well. In Montreal alone, 2% of the whole Chinese population was deported in 1 year, and these kind of things began happening all across Canada, but especially in the West Coast and in Vancouver, where most of the population was. This continued for years, and it began to spread, and they began to ban other drugs, and in the early 1920s, marijuana was banned in Canada. But it was like such a non-event that nobody knew it had happened. It was only just written down on one of the documents. The words marijuana, hemp, or cannabis were not uttered in Parliament, and no one's really even sure why it was banned at the time or why Canada would do that before the US. They think that there was a UN conference, and at the UN conference they'd been talking about banning cannabis, and one of the cops came back and added it to the schedule, but the fact that Parliament had no idea what they were doing is shown that a few months after the law against marijuana was passed, they passed the Hemp Bounty Act to encourage more cannabis growing in the prairies. So they didn't even know this was the same plant or what they were doing. And cannabis medicines were still widely available during the 1920s. People were still using them. And I don't think they realized at the time that this was the same thing that they were dealing with. The cannabis and hashish and Indian hemp and marijuana, this was all the same thing. In the 1920s, we did see this racial hatred and strife in Canada continue and grow. And there was a prevalent belief among white media people that the Chinese especially were going to plot together to dominate and take over the country. And this is very common. There was a book called The Writing on the Wall, a popular novel in the early 1920s that told the story of a white couple in Vancouver who become opium addicts to the clever Chinese who enslave them, and then they use their position in white society to infiltrate the government. And by the end of the book, the Chinese overlords control Canada. We're all addicted to opium and we're slaves to our foreign controllers. And these kind of fears, although they were based on pure fantasy, they were taken quite seriously. It wasn't only fictional novels. Maclean's magazine serialized a bunch of articles by a woman named Emily Murphy, who wrote under the patriotic name Janie Canuck. She stood up for white Canada, and she and her writings were published or put together into a book called The Black Candle. And in there she says in there that the Chinese are too clever to use opium, and they only bring it in to get white people addicted to it. So she's actually reversing history. It had been the British that had forced the Chinese to take opium earlier on. Now she was saying the Chinese didn't use opium, and they were just using it to get the white folks, especially our white women. We know that's what they really want. And she had the same fears about blacks and marijuana as well. And this book, she quoted a police chief in Los Angeles. He described marijuana as driving people completely insane, to terrible acts of violence and killing. And these kind of stories were common in the newspapers at the time as well. The Canadian papers, mostly there were stories about things happening in the US, of elementary school children murdering each other after smoking marijuana cigarettes and then dying of overdoses themselves. And they described how whole cities in the southern US had been so taken over by the marijuana scourge that the police couldn't walk down the streets without being attacked and murdered, and this Mexican violence was going to creep up across America and into Canada like a deadly vine and swallow us all. And these stories were very prevalent and very common, although who was actually getting busted in Canada at this time for cannabis possession? It was almost entirely, in the late 1930s and early 40s, it was almost entirely black jazz musicians in Montreal. Every story I could find in Canada about somebody getting busted for cannabis possession was some black jazz musician in Montreal, usually traveling through Canada, getting caught with a couple of marijuana cigarettes and getting a mandatory 6-month jail sentence. That was the sentence at the time for possession, 6 months in jail. Also, occasionally it was sailors getting caught as well, who would be coming back to Canada in the Navy or otherwise, and they'd get caught with a few joints. But that was pretty much the two groups. But let me just go back a little bit, actually. I skipped ahead past the real prohibition of cannabis in Canada. So we had these first laws coming in the 20s that cannabis was banned, but nobody was really paying attention, and it was still available. We saw this racism and this fear of cannabis coming in the late 20s. But we also saw the development of something that could have meant the comeback of cannabis in Canada. Because you know how I talked about that problem with those hemp fibers, how hard they are to separate? Well, a new machine had been invented in the late 1920s called the decorticator. And this was basically a tractor that you could drive through your hemp field, and it would pull out that inner pulpy herd and separate it from those fibers. And so the media and farmers at this time were excited, because this meant they could not only access those long, strong fibers with such minimal effort compared to the last 200 years or more, but also that inner pulpy mass that they were used to throw away and have a waste product, that would suddenly become very valuable. And you could use that to make plastics, you could use that to make cellophane, you could use that to make fuel, paper, and a wide variety of products. And so as this knowledge of the decorticator spread, and this became something that was going to revolutionize things, it was in the media quite a bit. There was actually a famous article in Popular Mechanics that came out in February 1938, and the article was called Hemp, the New Billion-Dollar Crop. And it talked about how this new decorticator technology, which had been helped to be perfected by a Canadian named Howard Fraley in Ontario, but this new decorticator technology was going to mean that hemp was going to be so valuable again, and it was going to be so widely grown again. And that was in February 1938. In August 1938 in Canada, the marijuana laws were amended to cover all the cannabis varieties, all cannabis plants, including cannabis hemp. And why that happened is a mystery. Perhaps it was a conspiracy from the petroleum industries that were becoming very powerful at the time, and whose nylons and textiles and pharmaceutical drugs and fuels were going to be competing with hemp, or maybe it was just the racism and ignorance, or whatever happened. But in 1938, the RCMP went out and burned hemp fields to the ground in Canada to launch the war on marijuana. The articles in the paper said that farmers had no idea that this crop they had been growing for so many years was indeed a deadly narcotic drug. They had no idea that was the truth. And the first person in Canada, the first recorded charge for marijuana possession in Canada, is a guy named Harry Forbes. He was busted in Vancouver for possession of some of those pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes. He said he bought them at a pharmacy to treat his hay fever. The judge said that's a deadly narcotic and gave him 18 months of hard labor.
Wow.
And the first record we have of somebody being convicted for cannabis trafficking was also a pharmacist on the East Coast. He said the same thing. He said, I don't think cannabis is a narcotic, and they also gave him quite a stiff sentence. And so we see that the war on marijuana in Canada began with farmers having their fields burned and medical marijuana patients having their medicine taken away. That was the beginning of the real war on cannabis in 1938. And we saw films like Assassin of Youth and this propaganda campaign really putting the fear into a lot of people and a lot of confusion, and that's how things began. And then a couple of years later, during World War II, they actually legalized cannabis hemp cultivation in Canada for the war effort. Same thing happened in the US, where it was banned, and then a few years later they brought it back. And in the US they made a famous film called Hemp for Victory that you might have seen or heard about. But in Canada we didn't make any movies, but they did start growing hemp again for 2 more years during World War II. But once the war was over, no more cannabis hemp was grown for industry in Canada until 1996 and the modern hemp revival. But what did come out of World War II in terms of the cannabis culture was an increase of marijuana use, because these young Canadian men went overseas to France, other parts of Europe and Africa. They were exposed to hash and marijuana, and they brought that habit and that knowledge back with them. And they went to colleges and universities, and they spread knowledge of the cannabis plant in that regard to a lot of their classmates and their friends. And we know now that a lot of these soldiers would have been suffering from PTSD after having been through the extreme violence of World War II, and they wouldn't have looked upon it that way back then, but we know that using cannabis would have helped them to deal with those effects and that psychological trauma, and that might be one of the reasons why they kept on using it. And then we see through the 40s the development of the beat culture, and the beat generation culture evolves to the 50s and to the hippie culture, and marijuana use starts becoming very popular. In the 1950s, actually, when cannabis was first becoming popular, there was a Senate committee set up to look at the marijuana laws and figure out what to do. They only listened to police and prosecutors and the American Harry Anslinger, and they recommended more severe penalties. So that in the 1950s, by the end of the 50s, Canada had the most strict marijuana laws we've ever had. There was a mandatory minimum 7-year sentence for importing or growing cannabis, a law that was eventually struck down as unconstitutional, but lasted for many years. The laws against cannabis had mandatory minimums. In fact, in terms of strictness in the criminal code, it went treason, first-degree murder, growing and importing marijuana. That's how strictly it was treated in the 1950s. And yet, this was the time of the biggest blossoming of the cannabis culture across Canada. Those strict laws did nothing to stop people from sharing and using cannabis openly and widely. During the 1960s, especially the late 60s and early 70s, we did see use of cannabis spread widely, and we also saw arrests of cannabis users begin to go up from a few dozen a year to a few hundred to a few thousand to several thousand. And by the late 60s and early 70s, people started getting concerned because it was no longer a small number of marginalized people getting arrested. It was large numbers of mainstream people, young white youth, getting arrested. People started getting worried about that. And so they launched the Ledane Commission in Canada. This was a study to look at what cannabis policy should be and what the cannabis culture is. It was very exhaustive and one of the best things ever done in the world at that time. And they recommended, after a couple of years of analysis, that possession and personal... But for the most part, we've defeated these laws in most of the cities, and for most of Canada, bong shops are no longer really worried about. They're given business licenses and they become part of the mainstream. And then the same thing happened with seeds and the seed culture. And now, although there's not as many, certainly there's a lot of seed banks out there, and seeds are widely available. People did get busted for seeds in the 1990s. A good friend of mine, Ian Hunter, got charged for running a seed bank on Victoria and got a $500 fine. Mark Emery was convicted of selling seeds under American law, so that was a different situation, being extradited to the US. But in terms of Canadians selling seeds to other Canadians, the penalties were so minimal that the police and the courts just kind of gave up. Just like they gave up with bong shops, just like they're now giving up with dispensaries, which is kind of the third or fourth wave of this marijuana business, activism, civil disobedience movement. Because what we found is that when you can start a business that in and of itself is breaking the law and is changing things and is revolutionary, selling bongs and pipes, selling information, providing information, selling seeds, providing a safe space for cannabis users to gather, providing a space for medical users to get their medicine, or giving out cannabis seeds to grow in your garden. These tactics allow people to start a business, to make money that they can then use to put that money back into the movement. So to me, it's a real win-win, and how we've come so far across Canada since we began this kind of tactic in the mid-1990s. Because the laws have only gotten worse. Right now, we're still living under Stephen Harper's mandatory minimums, which are the harshest the laws have been since the 1950s. They don't stop us smoking pot, but these mandatory minimums, which actually today were struck down by the Supreme Court of Canada in a historic decision that said that mandatory minimums just in general are not constitutional and should not be allowed. That to me is a wonderful decision. Absolutely, it's huge. It'll have a huge impact. You know, especially for marijuana and minor drug offenses, the idea, it's really a battle between the conservatives saying, you judges are not putting people in jail long enough, so we're going to bypass you and force you to give people these extreme sentences. And I'm so glad the courts have struck that down. But we're still living in a country where 25,000 people or more have been, not charged, but have been arrested for cannabis possession since Trudeau became Prime Minister. There's no indication that charges or arrests have dropped at all, even though Trudeau told us Canadians, he told Canadians that he had smoked marijuana, and he smoked marijuana as an MP. We didn't punish him, we didn't chastise him, we elected him leader of our country. But if we get caught smoking a joint now, is he ready to forgive us yet? No, he's not at all. Maybe he will in the future, but right now he still wants the police to arrest you, he still wants you to be ashamed, he still wants you to be charged and humiliated and go through all that bullshit, and that is not right. You know, we need action on this now. We need this to change now. And that's what the Overgrow campaign is about, because we haven't got to where we are as a movement by waiting for the government to give us some freedom, you know. We've got there through a concerted effort of massive civil disobedience from coast to coast. It started with people rising up to open bong shops and open seed banks. It includes rallies and protests that now number in the tens of thousands in many cities, and are massive and huge, and cannabis is sometimes sold but always shared and smoked openly and freely. And this is how we've gained our freedom so far. So to me, an important part of the legalization equation, one of the key aspects that we need to remember as we hopefully move into legalization in the not too distant future, is that people should have the right to grow their own cannabis plants. That is very important. And it's not that I want everyone to have to grow their own cannabis. In fact, you shouldn't have to grow it at all. And the vast majority of users should not be bothered to grow their own cannabis, because you should be able to buy clean, pure, high potency, very low priced cannabis products very easily. So you shouldn't have to grow your own cannabis. But the way to make sure that the system works, the way to make sure that prices are low and quality is high, the way to make sure that people who need cannabis can get it no matter what, is to let every Canadian grow cannabis for themselves, for their family, for their friends, the same way they can brew beer and wine if they choose, the same way they can grow other plants if they choose. We can understand if we begin with some kind of limit, maybe we can grow a dozen plants each, and if you've got a medical note, then you can grow more. That's not the final answer, but I'll settle for that as a good start. But what I really want to see is I want to see farmers growing high THC cannabis plants by the thousands of hectares all across Canada. That to me is legalization. And that means prices are low. That's the future that I want. That means prices are low and quality are high. You know, when you're growing outdoors at a mass scale, you're not going to get perfectly manicured buds for the smoking. Those are still going to be a niche product that are going to be made on a smaller scale. But what you can get from farmers producing it on a large scale is resin that you can make anything out of. The purest THC, the purest CBD, any combination of all the cannabinoids, terpenoids, flavonoids. You can gather them together in any ratios and make whatever you want. A friend of mine was in Spain recently for Spanibus, a big cannabis expo in Spain, and he had pictures of big pure CBD crystals, which they espouse the useful medicine. In the same way, we've normalized bong shops and head shops. People don't even realize they're illegal anymore. I want people walking on the street going, oh, there's a cannabis plant. Oh, that looks nice. Oh, okay, whatever. And that's it. They're not freaking out anymore. That's the legalization I want to see. That's the future I want to have. If we grow so much cannabis, the police can't arrest us anymore for it, then it's going to make sure that we have that right when legalization comes, and it better come soon. Although, we're kind of making legalization happen ourselves. And really, across Canada, in terms of access to cannabis, it's been decided by mayors and city councillors. We're all looking to Trudeau to do something and for the federal government to do something, but what I see are dispensaries opening up across Canada faster than ever before, and I see cities making that decision about how to react to them. So that cities like Vancouver and Toronto and Victoria and Nanaimo and Port Alberni and Kimberley are deciding to allow dispensaries, as are many others. Although, on the other hand, I think today or yesterday in Campbell River, they raided a couple of dispensaries there because the mayor decided he didn't want dispensaries in his town. So talking to your mayor, talking to your city councilors, getting them on board, that's the way to make change happen right now in this country. And if you're living in Ottawa, you should talk to the mayor of Ottawa. But if you're not living here, or if you're thinking about opening a cannabis business, sometimes it can be a good idea not to do it in the main city, but to do it next door, where you've got a more favorable person in power, where you can maybe make some things happen that way without having to challenge things in the big city. And there's plenty of folks that do that. There's a guy named Jerry Martin who lives in Whitewood. It's a small town between Regina and Saskatoon. And because it's a small town, his dispensary is able to have a big impact there. And he serves customers from a lot of outlying areas, and he uses his money to feed himself and live a life, but he uses a lot of his money to give back to his community. So he funds the girls' volleyball team to get new uniforms, and he gives money to the fire department to help get a new engine, and he pays for all kinds of positive things in his community and gives to the food banks and local charities. And he does it because he's a great guy and he wants to give back to his town, but it also makes it very difficult to arrest the guy who's selling medical marijuana to sick patients and then uses his money to help make the community better. And in a small town like that, it makes a big difference. And that's one of the reasons he's still operating. So, the idea of being in a smaller area and starting your business that way can be very effective. Now, I said I would talk about how to open a cannabis dispensary and how to start your own cannabis business. And a lot of what I say is just to go forward and not be so afraid, to think of what the worst case scenario could be. And if you can handle that, then you should consider going for it. If you can't handle that, then find a different way to get involved. But running a cannabis dispensary doesn't take thousands of dollars and a lot of money. You might the big expense is getting a storefront and doing any renovations or any rent or anything like that. But in terms of having product and supply, you don't need dozens of strains and pounds of pot in your backyard. 4 or 5 varieties of cannabis, a few ounces of each, a little bit of edibles, a few kinds of hash maybe, or some shatter, and you can start your dispensary like that. You'll add products and increase things as you go along, but your patients will be happy to see you to start, and as you grow and develop, they'll be happy to see you do that. We started our dispensary in Vancouver in 2008. We were the 3rd one to open in the city, and the first place to call ourselves a dispensary. Before that, they were calling themselves Compassion Club. Same thing, just different term. But when we opened up, I was nervous. Even though there was 2 others, I was still worried about getting busted. And we used to keep all of our money and all of our weed in one little kind of metal suitcase thing together like that until the bank said, "Your money smells like weed too often. Can you please separate those?" So we were like, okay, we did. Although actually banking can be a challenge when you got a dispensary. Finding a bank that will work with you as a dispensary is not easy. I've been kicked out of some of the biggest banks in Canada. I think they only like it if you're dealing in the billions of dollars and you're laundering that kind of drug money. Then HSBC and the rest are totally into that. But on a small scale, if you tell them you're a dispensary, a lot of banks won't work with you. So consider local credit unions. Credit unions are often much more friendly, much more amenable to the dispensary concept, and that's the place to go if you want to get an account and start a dispensary. But also, instead of a storefront, here's an idea I give people quite often, is think about a delivery service. A delivery service can actually be very effective. There's less money involved in terms of you don't have to have rent, you don't have to have renovations. Your overhead is much lower as a result. If you or your driver is allowed to possess medical cannabis, and it's very hard for the police to arrest that person if they're carrying around 150 grams or less, or whatever their limit is, as long as it's not really labeled for other people, it's pretty much impossible for you to be charged. And you can reach a lot of patients very easily. You can make a website, you can put ads in the paper, you can have a phone number. You want to put your face to stuff, I think. Trying to be anonymous and this kind of thing is not always a good idea. They're going to figure out who you are anyways, but doing it that way, you go to the patient's house on your first visit and you're not bringing them any cannabis. Your first visit is to meet them and get their paperwork in order and make sure they're a valid medical user, and In that kind of situation, it's very difficult for the cops. They got to rent a house, they got to have a fake person with fake paperwork, and even then if they do that and they catch you, all they've got is the pot you brought to that person that day. They don't have your storefront and all your money and all your weed. And so a delivery service can be effective, and mail order can be effective as well. There's a few tricks to learn in mail order, mainly how to avoid your mail being stolen by postal workers. They're a much bigger threat than the police ever are when it comes to Canada Post. But you can learn that and how to deal with those issues, make sure everything's nicely sealed. Sometimes they will poke your parcel with a pin to break that vacuum seal, so keep that in mind, because they are clever folks and they steal a lot of weed when they can. But a delivery service can be effective, a storefront can be effective, but the main thing is don't blow a lot of money trying to make it perfect. Just do what the basics that you need to get things open. And you know, the worst case scenario for this, I said to imagine the worst case. Well, the worst case is you're going to lose some money and some time, and maybe you won't be able to go to the US anymore. Those are probably the worst situations. You're very unlikely to go to jail, maybe for a few hours if you get busted. Nobody's going to jail overnight anymore. You know, when they used to bust Mark and bong shops in the early days, they would come after you on a Friday afternoon, ideally on a long weekend, and they time it so that by the time you got behind bars, there was no justice of the peace to talk to you, and so you spend the weekend in jail and you wouldn't get out until maybe Tuesday morning. But I have not seen that kind of behavior when it comes to dispensaries. The police, from what I've seen, generally, it depends, but are kind of apologetic and friendly about it and don't try to go out of their way to cram the handcuffs on real tight or to drive the police truck really hard around those corners, which I've seen them do to friends of mine back in the day. But so if you can handle that loss of money and the potential of having those challenges, but you can rebuild after that and you can survive after that. And I give the example of a couple of friends of mine. They tried to open a dispensary in Burnaby several years ago, but I don't know, 5 years ago now, I guess, and they made a good start of it, but the Burnaby RCMP came in and raided them and charged them, and they both ended up pleading guilty in the end and getting community service, which they did with me at Sensible BC, pushing for marijuana legalization. And one of them now ended up moving back to Hamilton, and she runs the Cloud9 Vapor Lounge in Hamilton. So she found a way she really wanted to have a marijuana business. She believes in this. She wants to be an activist, wants to be a businesswoman, and didn't work out for her the first time, but she kept working at it, and now she's got a great place. And if you're in Hamilton, go to Cloud9, it rocks. And so you can do that. You can rebuild. You can take inspiration from people like that. And there's ways of making that change happen. You don't have to give up. And I've seen a lot of dispensaries get raided and reopened. Most dispensaries in Canada now have never been raided. The raided ones are a tiny percentage, and usually in unlucky small towns, or sometimes they're doing something to push themselves getting raided, but usually they're just in the wrong town at the wrong time. An example is Nanaimo, where 10 dispensaries were operating in Nanaimo. And the city and council and the mayor and the police were, this is too many dispensaries, we shouldn't have any, what's going on? So they threatened them all at first and told them they were going to raid them, and the dispensary said, okay, thanks for the warning, we're going to hide some of our weed now. And then the police came in, and in one day they raided 3 dispensaries in Nanaimo. And the next day, all 3 dispensaries reopened again. Those raids cost about $100,000, we estimate, for the Nanaimo Police Department. That comes out of the Nanaimo policing budget. And after they all reopened again, a week later, the city of Nanaimo said, you know what? We're going to look at regulating dispensaries now. We're not going to raid them anymore. And those dispensary operators, they got charged. They've been charged for trafficking in marijuana. But for them anyways, when they've gone to court, they had 2 times. They were supposed to go and get fingerprinted, and they all showed up. And they got told by the clerk or whoever there that there was nothing for them there to do that day, and nobody had called them, and they should go home and wait to hear back later. And the same thing happened when they came in for their first court hearing. They were told again, we don't really have anything, nobody wrote your name down, just go home and don't worry about it. That doesn't happen every time to everybody, certainly, but when it comes to dispensaries especially, I think that the courts and the police, and they know that nothing's really going to come out of this. It's not really worth the effort, especially these days, and that they really are just kind of embarrassed to drop the charges too quickly. But I don't expect any of those Nanaimo folks to end up going to jail or having any kind of serious repercussions other than having all their cannabis taken and the time and hassle they're going through. So you can take these risks, be aware of what you're doing, consider, if you want to do this, consider a delivery service, consider getting a nice storefront and doing something. There's other ways of having a cannabis business as well, and of course you're in one of them. A vapor lounge could be an effective way to give people a safe place to do things, and the challenges there are related to business licenses and community support, but It's very difficult for them to come after you. They can come and harass your clients if they want to, but that wears thin pretty fast, especially when a lot of them are going to be medical users who have got their cards, and to try to sort through who's allowed to possess a joint and who isn't, it's not worth their effort. And so we're seeing vapor lounges being successful, but it is a challenge and it is risky and something you want to think about. Seed banks are out there too. It's a bit more of a nuanced area and not the biggest, the most easiest thing to get into, but there's certainly room for marijuana seed sellers out there. But those are all things to think about if you want to get a cannabis business and really kind of devote your life to this. But you know, not everybody in this room, I expect, is going to start a dispensary, and that's okay, you know. But if you want to get involved, there's other things you can do too. And you know, we got Russell Barth in the room, and I talk about you, Russell, during my talk sometimes, and you just having a snack there. But I bring you up as an example of somebody who can be very effective from their own home with a fair amount of effort, but not really huge amounts of time. And Russell's a medical marijuana user, as is his wife, and they both have a lot of health challenges, and they care passionately about marijuana. And so when Russell sees an article online or in the paper that pisses him off, or some stupid propaganda stuff, instead of writing something in the comments section, he would write a letter to the editor, and they would get published very often. And I think Russell still holds the title as Canada's most published writer of letters to the editor. From his living room, he's managed to reach millions of Canadians with the message. Give him a round of applause. And he's not doing it for applause. He's doing it because he cares, because it pisses him off, and because he writes really good letters. 3 or 4 sentences, pithy, sarcastic, funny. They will print that. So, and it's very effective. You can reach a lot of people. And even if they don't print your letter, the fact that they got your letter makes them more likely to print someone else's letter saying something very similar. If they get one letter on a topic, they might not print it. If they get 6 or 7, they'll pick out of those. So you will have an impact. And it's a simple way you can make a change and do that. Just talking to people is an effective thing. Conversations, one-on-one. And especially to talk to your local politicians. Like I said, calling up your mayor, making an appointment with your mayor is so important. If every single person in this room during the next 2 weeks called their mayor and had a conversation with the mayor's office, called your local MP and MLA, it would have an impact. But especially your mayors and councillors. There's the ones who typically don't necessarily have a strong opinion, who could be swayed by people around them in their community. In Kelowna, there was 3 dispensaries, and the police raided one, and they were under pressure. They were trying to reopen, and the cops were like, if you reopen, we're going to come back again. The other dispensaries were all nervous. The mayor was saying, oh, it's a federal issue, and I don't know, and I don't really support this. And so we had a rally in front of City Hall. I went up there and made some speeches, but more importantly, we arranged to get a couple of 100 people who lived in Kelowna to call the mayor. And over a 2-week period, he got about 200 phone calls. And at the end of that time, he was in the media saying, well, dispensaries are pretty good, actually. I understand why they're needed. That dispensary that had been raided reopened. It hasn't been raided again. And things are cool for dispensaries in Kelowna now. So it shows you can have an influence. The mayor didn't really care one way or the other, but the marijuana haters had been calling him, saying there's a weed shop in town. And if the haters call and we don't call, then the haters win. And the haters can be very effective. There's a woman named Pamela McCall, and she's my nemesis in Vancouver. Boo, hiss, boo, Pamela McCall. Pamela Uncool, we call her. Our little joke. But you know, I kind of owe her a debt of gratitude in a way, right? She called several of my venues at the early part of my tour. She didn't call places like this, but she called the mainstream halls that we were renting. And in Kelowna and in Calgary, both venues that we had rented canceled on us after she said that I was going to be giving away cannabis seeds, and that there was going to be, well, that was actually quite loud, and that there was, you know, going to be law breaking. And she called the police, and I think that it was her calling the Calgary police that made them come down and give me the incredible free publicity boost that I got at that stop there, you know, because it was good, actually. I have to say, like, I've never been arrested for marijuana in my life. I've certainly never spent the night in jail. I've tried, but it has not been my role or my fate to be charged for marijuana until this, and it worked out so well. It was kind of a beautiful moment. They actually charged one of our volunteers at the event. He'd run out to the van to get some more seeds, and there was cops milling around, but we were still doing our thing, and they were giving away seeds. But having him run to the van by himself, that was a mistake. He was isolated. Our van was there, so they grabbed him, grabbed our van. I heard someone had been arrested. I was just doing question and answer period, talking to people, so I ran out there to see what was going on. I can't dab right now. I'm going to wait. My throat's already like parched, actually. That's a good... Yeah, they arrested one of our volunteers who was getting seeds, so I went out there with a big crowd behind me, and what's going on, who's been arrested, and we found the guy in the back of the police car, and the officer said, well, we're arresting him for charging him with trafficking in marijuana seeds. And I said, well, this is my event, and I'm the guy giving away seeds. If you're going to arrest anybody, you got to arrest me. You can't arrest that guy. So I grabbed some cannabis seeds. Someone had one of the pouches were there, and I sprinkled a few seeds into people's hands. They all started saying, arrest me, I've got seeds. And I said, I've got seeds too, officer, you should arrest me. And he was like, okay, I'm not gonna arrest those guys, but I'll arrest you. Come on, man, let's go. So we walk, I got my seeds in my hand, and we walk along with 6 officers all around me, and everyone's shouting, shame, shame, and you know, they're not violent, nobody's threatening the cops or throwing rocks or anything like that, but they're just yelling and making their displeasure known very vocally, right? So we walk over to the police car, they put me in the back of the car, and the officer comes around, takes the 6 seeds I had left in my hand, puts them in a little evidence bag. We drive off for about 20 minutes, we pull into the police station. Just as he's pulling in, he goes, oh, actually, we're going to go somewhere else. And he pulls out. I go, why? He goes, I don't know. They just tell me where to go. And we drive for another 45 minutes to a different one. But what had happened there is that Cindy, my assistant, had been saying back at the event, we're going to go to that jail. We're going to get Dana out of there. We're not going to let this stand. We're going to make sure he's free. So they were like, oh, there's going to be a stoner ride at the jail. So they drove me to the more distant jail, took the other guy there as well. Kept us there till around 4 a.m. They released the other guy with no charges, and I think they might have charged him if I hadn't volunteered myself, so I hope that I got him off the hook with that action. I'm not normally going to go out there and demand to be arrested, but I felt because they'd arrested somebody else there, that wasn't right. It was I'm the guy giving away seeds. I don't want to see some innocent bystander getting caught, right? So they kept me all night. I had to post bail in the morning, $1,000 bail, and I can't possess or give away any drug except with a doctor's note or dentist prescription, including cannabis seeds, except when I'm at work. Those are the conditions. So I'm allowed to use drugs and anything I want and cannabis seeds while I'm at work. And the reasoning was that I run medical marijuana dispensaries in Vancouver. It's by job, and I should be allowed to do that. Of course, they're as illegal, probably more illegal, selling pounds of marijuana over several years to thousands of people is probably more illegal than giving away the high CBD cannabis seeds. But anyways, I'm allowed to do that at work. But to me, they didn't say at work at that address. And to me, I'm at work right now. This is my life's work, right? So I'm always at work. You know, but I'm trying to be careful, and I'm not handling the seeds so much when I'm in public, because I don't want this to be the Dana gets arrested at every stop tour. But I really, you know, the police have not shown up. Well, they showed up today at Parliament Hill a little bit. We had a little gathering there. About a half dozen of us came out to chat a little bit, and there was probably a dozen cops, 2 to 1, standing around with their automatic weapons and that. But that was fine. I'm in jail. I get out. I got to put $1,000 bail. I've got a $10,000 surety. I got these conditions. I can't smoke pot except at work. I get my tie and my belt back for as I'm leaving, and the guy gives me back the evidence bag with the 6 seeds in it. And I'm like, is this a trap? Are they gonna like give me that, and then I'm gonna walk out, and they're all gonna, oh, we got you now, Larsen. You just broke your bail. But no, they have no idea what they're doing or what's going on. So they give me this bag back. I've still got it in my stuff. I'm gonna bring it to the trial and be like, this is the house. If they don't take it seriously and they're giving me my seeds back, how seriously should the court look at this, right? Because while I was in that holding cell, they made me sign a piece of paper to acknowledge that they had told me officially that they were going to seek a mandatory minimum sentence against me. That means at least 6 months in jail is what they're looking for. Now they've abolished mandatory minimum sentences, so I don't get to complain about that anymore, I guess. But it was, to me, it just shows how ridiculous. I can't believe they're seeking that when the last guy to get convicted of this got a $500 fine, and when giving away cannabis seeds or selling cannabis seeds is widespread across Canada, right? But anyways, that was my experience in the jail there, and I guess I'm going on a little bit. But what I want to do for you is I've talked about the history of cannabis and culture, and I've talked about your role maybe in helping to make that future happen, because that historical story that I was telling, it doesn't end here now. This isn't the ending. This is the middle of that story. We're just beginning to really tell the whole story. And you're at home, and your grandchild is there with you, and they're cramming for an exam, getting ready before they go to school in the morning. And they got their history book open, and they're flipping through it and reading, and then they turn to you and they say, "Hey, Grandma or Granddad, I'm reading in my history book here that cannabis used to be illegal in Canada, and that people, for like 100 years, people would go to jail and get busted and arrested and persecuted for this, and it was a really big deal. They spent billions of dollars, and all around the world, millions and millions of people were charged, and that they're going to say, this seems so weird to me, because I'm having cannabis hemp seed porridge for breakfast, and the book that I'm reading this on, I know it's printed on hemp paper, and I know that you use marijuana medicines to treat the aches and pains of being a senior citizen, and I know that we have a patch of cannabis in the backyard that I love helping you grow and work on, and I know that the bus that takes me to school runs on hemp seed diesel fuel, and it's made out of hemp composite fiberboard, and that the school itself was also made out of cannabis hemp fiber, and so all these things, and how could it be that this plant that's all around us and is so useful, how could this plant have been illegal for so long? I want you to be able to say, yeah, it's true. It was illegal, and when I grew up, it was banned, and people would go to jail. Maybe me or my friends got busted and went to jail. We certainly were afraid of that, and we had to hide our cannabis use, and it was a big deal, and they wanted us to be ashamed of that, and we had to really, hide it away, and it was a real challenge and a real dark time. But you know what? I got involved to help change those laws, and I worked to legalize marijuana, to end that prohibition. When Dana came to Ottawa, I took some of those seeds and I went and I planted them all over the place, and I helped start a cannabis business. I marched at 420. I wrote letters to the editor. I did something. I made a sacrifice to change those laws, to end prohibition. I made some effort to end the war on marijuana in Canada. And I did that so that you would never have to know, so that the future generations would never have to know what it is to be charged or arrested for what herbal medicine they use, or to be persecuted or ashamed for what plants they grow in their garden. That's the legacy that I want to leave to future generations, to my kids and grandkids. And we had an opportunity in the 1970s and we missed it, and we have an opportunity now. Let's take it. Let's seize the moment. Let's plant these cannabis seeds all across Canada, and if we do that, then together we can reap a harvest of freedom. So thank you very much for listening to my talk and being with me here today. Hope you enjoyed that journey through cannabis in Canada. And I'm going to answer any questions you might have and have a little chat.
Is it true that if you have your medical marijuana license and you want to deliver for your own delivery dispensary, you said it's hard to get charged? Is that true?
Well, if you're allowed to possess, right now, people are allowed to possess 150 grams, but no more. Many people are allowed to have that.
Yep.
If you're driving in your car with 149 grams, which you're planning to deliver to somebody else, because that's their order for their medical marijuana, and you're speeding and the cop pulls you over and he says, hey, you got marijuana. You go, well, I got a card here. I'm allowed to have 50 grams. If that pot is labeled for Joe Smith at address and he owes me this much money, then you might get in trouble, right? But even then, it's going to be a hassle for them to do it, because it's going to be harder than for a regular person. That card even helps in that situation. But you're not going to have it labeled like that, obviously, right? It's going to be labeled, this is my pot. And then you're going to be fine. So in that situation, it definitely helps to have that permit. It also helps even if your car smells like weed, before they even get to saying how much you got. But it smells like weed because I'm a medical marijuana user and I got some weed in my car, and they don't even really have the right to start searching you, really, depending on the cop and the circumstances. Yeah. So it's not an absolute guarantee, but it makes it very difficult and pretty much impossible for them if it's not labeled as being for somebody else and you're under your limit. And you shouldn't be speeding and getting pulled over anyways, right? But I mean, that's the worst case scenario. So I think that definitely helps a lot with the delivery service. Anybody else want to ask me anything? No pressure, but I do know a lot about cannabis.
How many seeds did you say you gave away already?
So far, we've given away over 400,000 seeds. We could be at 500,000 by now. I had I had about 50,000 or so THC seeds of all different varieties, and I promised I was going to have 100,000, so I actually got a bit of a backlog on my THC seed orders, but I've had a bunch of donations recently. We've been able to catch up on those, and so the outstanding THC seeds it's hard to say a lot of times, THC seed, CBD seed, it's like a tongue twister. But anyways, we're gonna get caught up on that, and then on the website, I'm gonna make that an option again to get THC seeds again. But I took it off a while ago because I was already backlogged. I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep, right? But a lot more donations have been coming in, especially since the bust in Calgary. But most of the seeds that I have, the ones that I have millions and millions of, it's a CBD variety. We're calling it Freedom Dream, which is just a name I made up because I can't tell you the exact strain name because the hemp farmer who gave them to me might get in trouble. But what I can tell you about these plants, the Freedom Dream strain, and I'll put this on the website soon too, but they will grow a 5-foot tall plant. This is a strain that is grown commercially for seed production. So it makes a big honkin' cola. It'll grow a 5-foot tall plant with a large main bud and minimal side branching on the female plants. Now, commercially, they let the male plants pollinate it, that big bud, but full of seeds, and then those are the seeds that end up in your Manitoba Harvest food pack or whatever, right, at Safeway. But if you grow it Sensimilla style, you don't let it get any pollen on it, you let it get its full resin potential, it'll make somewhere between 8 and 12% CBD in the dried bud. That's not as much as your THC plant will get indoors under lights, but it's a pretty good amount of CBD. You can get 1,500 milligrams perhaps of pure CBD out of that plant, or however you make the extract. I wouldn't recommend smoking those buds, but if you grow it on your own property and you get it to maturity and you harvest those buds and you dry them out and cure them, you could definitely make extract out of it and use that CBD for medicinal purposes. But, you know, some people have told me, oh, like my wife's really sick and I need some medical marijuana. I built a big grow room and I'm going to use your seeds. And I'm like, don't use my seeds. Like, they're free and I'll give them to you, but go buy some seeds. If you've got a grow room and you're spending a lot of money and you've got someone whose health is at stake, don't cheap out on the seeds, right? Like, you know, my seeds are for fun. They're for political purposes. They're hopefully people who buy the THC seeds will get some buds at the end of the year. Hopefully people who grow my cannabis plants, the CBD ones, will get some big colas and get some good CBD medicine out of it. That'd be great. But the vast majority of these plants are going to be grown in public areas where they're not going to get to maturity. They're going to get killed. They're going to die. They're going to not survive. They might get to a happy state, and then some hater is going to see them and freak out. So, you know, these plants, I said you can grow them, get some medicine out of them. That's great. But if you really need strong medicinal cannabis, go to the Vancouver Seed Bank, which I helped found, or Crop King Seeds. He's a great guy. Order them in the mail. But that's what I've got anyways. And so we've had a lot. I'm going to fall over on this thing. So that's what I've got. That's the main strain. And you know, if you want to just get tons of seeds, I don't think it makes it harder. I would suggest that perhaps you do use cannabis therapeutically or medicinally, that you just don't really realize that. Not that I want to challenge you on what you're doing with your own marijuana and your own body, but I know that certainly, you know, if it makes you feel good, it helps you sleep, it gives you an appetite, those are all medicinal benefits or the things that you might enjoy about it, right? You just might not see it that way. But regardless of that, not having your paperwork doesn't really make any difference. I don't have any paperwork myself. I'm not a legal medical user. That shouldn't stop you running a dispensary or your staff, because being a legal user, although it might get you out of trouble if you're caught with some pot that you can claim as your own, doesn't help you if you've got a store, because that pot's clearly not for personal use. It's on the shelf with the price on it, right? So that doesn't really protect you in that way, right? It kind of helps get you sympathy, perhaps, if you're in the media saying, I used marijuana, I was going to die, now I'm better, I want to help other people. That looks good and that helps you sort of politically and in the media, but it's not an essential thing. And if you say, someone I care for uses marijuana and they're helped by it and I want to provide other people because I see it how it helps them, that's just as good pretty much, right? But that kind of personal narrative does help you in the media and in terms of how you get treated. But the main thing is you want to look like somebody who's a responsible person who wants to help people and not somebody who's like some kind of bad person or a profiteer or whatever. You look like a respectable young man, and so I think that would be good. So it doesn't really make a difference in terms of that. The main thing is how you present yourself and what your kind of narrative is. But the police aren't going to give you a pass on your dispensary because you're a medical user or not. That won't really affect things for you too much either way. But if you hire a driver for your delivery service, try to get someone who's got that permit, because that'll help them, right? So, anybody else?
Dana, why did you get involved in all this?
Well, I got involved as a pot activist in university. I started smoking pot in high school when I was around 18, 19, a lot older than a lot of people that I know. And I thought it was a great thing. I really enjoyed it. I started learning about it, and I read a book called The Emperor Wears No Clothes. That was a very influential book and really opened my eyes to a lot of the the benefits of cannabis. In university, first year university at Simon Fraser, I started a club called the League for Ethical Action on Drugs, LEAD. I made some like-minded friends, and together we started this group. We used to have meetings on campus and safety meetings on campus as well. Do you guys call it safety meetings in Ontario when you go get high, or is that just a... Yeah, okay, I was like, total silence. I was like, we call them safety meetings in BC, I don't know. But I know when someone's from East, when they're doing like bottle tokes and stuff, because that's not like a BC thing at all. And I know no one here would do this, but don't mix tobacco with your pot. That's like, whenever someone, it doesn't happen a lot, but whenever someone hands me a joint with tobacco in it, that person is from Ontario. So talk to your friends. Don't let your friends mix tobacco with their marijuana. That's not cool. We gotta warn people anyways if you're gonna Yeah, half quarters too. Yeah, you're not gonna be called mates. Yeah, but anyways, yeah. So I started this club on campus. Started bringing other people onto campus to speak. We organized some protests and rallies in Vancouver. And then when I graduated from university, Mark Emery just moved to town. He opened Hemp BC, and I started working for him doing Cannabis Canada magazine, which became Cannabis Culture. And what I've liked about my personal career as a marijuana activist, what has been good for me is that I get to do all kinds of different cool stuff, right? I'm not the kind of guy who wants to go to the same job every day. I like new adventures and excitement. I like starting new projects. And so with this, I've gotten to start the BC Marijuana Party and the Canadian Marijuana Party. I got to do political work with the NDP, a lot of it quite challenging, but a lot of work politically. I've gotten to open businesses, the Vancouver Seed Bank, Vancouver Dispensary Society, and see those things help people. I like writing books and stories. I've got to write some funny books about pot and my cannabis history, those kind of things I enjoy. And so for me, it's been a great journey. And what I really like now, and what I didn't really expect maybe when I first started doing this and became more, I'm doing this a long time, 20 years, right? But most of the time I wasn't on a stage talking to people. I was just working at my desk or typing or trying to help Mark Emery if he was busted or in jail or whatever, and doing things together with our group. And only the last few years have I sort of become like a spokesperson and talk to people on that. And what means the most to me is that I'm out talking to people and they say, Dana, I heard you speak or I heard you do something, and because you said that, I thought, yeah, I'm going to go do that. And now here's a thing that I did because you inspired me to go do something, right? And I've been inspired by other people and seen the sacrifices and risks they've taken, and that's inspired me to get out there. And when somebody tells me that they did something because I suggested they go for it and then it worked out for them, sometimes they go, fuck, I got busted, man. Like, if I hadn't listened to you, I wouldn't have had this happen. But they're always still happy they tried, and a lot of times they get up on it, they try it again. But that to me is something I didn't expect and I'm kind of surprised about. And when I did Sensible BC in British Columbia, we launched a big referendum campaign, and we had 4,000 volunteers getting signatures. We got 200,000 signatures in 90 days. And what I thought was surprising, people said to me over and over again, thanks for giving me something to do. Like, I want to legalize pot, I believe in it, I live in a small town, I don't know what to do, I don't have a lot of money, I don't know, if I go stand in the corner and talk about marijuana, people think I'm crazy if I just do that by myself, right? And so, but being a part of a team, I give them a clipboard and a badge and an identity and a job, and they're part of 4,000 people. Now when they stand on a street corner talking about pot, they're part of a movement, they're part of a group, and people thank me for giving them something to do, and I thought that's really neat. Like, I didn't expect that. But there's a lot of people out there, maybe in this room, who want to do something, who want to get involved and want to make change, and they don't really know what they can do, and I got some ideas, and I maybe can give them some courage to say, we've done this here, and this is how it works, and you don't have to be afraid to try it yourself. And so that's the story of me as a pot activist. And I love smoking weed. Like, since the first time I smoked pot, I've tried many other substances. I've had some wonderful psychedelic trips. I enjoy beer and wine once in a while, but marijuana is a great substance. I say in some of my speeches that deciding to smoke pot was the best decision I ever made in my life, and that it was something that's been very good to me. Marijuana's brought me it made me think thoughts I wouldn't have had before, good ideas. It's helped me feel healthier. I talked about it, to improve my sex life. It's made so many things better for me. So I want to get back to that. And I think I had a pretty blessed kind of life. I never really had any terrible things happen to me. And so if I have the opportunity to use whatever I got to help other people to get cannabis and enjoy themselves and end this war and stuff, I think it's time well spent. So that's the reason I got involved, and I just think it's an important issue. And for me, it's not just about pot, really. Pot's a key, but it's about the greater war on drugs, which to me is really the war on plants, coca leaves, opium poppies, psilocybe mushrooms, peyote plants, cannabis. These are all plants that in their natural forms are very wonderful and have centuries and millennia of cultural and social use. And I think the war on drugs really makes them more dangerous and more harmful and causes a lot of problems around the world. That's another talk that I can give about the whole war on drugs, which I won't do right now, but that's what I'm hoping to change with my work.
Speaking on the war on drugs, how do you feel about Blair helping out with the legalization?
Sorry, how do I feel about
Ex-police chief Blair from Toronto.
Blair being in charge?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a political decision that they've made. The whole way they're approaching legalization is designed to diffuse their opponents, right? So the Liberals would say things like, we're going to legalize marijuana and add tough new penalties to stop people selling it to minors. Well, it's already a mandatory frickin' minimum, right? But they can't say, we're going to legalize marijuana and make it easier to sell marijuana to minors. They just can't say that, even though that's actually going to be the case, because the penalty of selling to minors has to be more in line with the penalty of selling alcohol to a minor, which is a fine, maybe you lose your license, but you're not getting a jail sentence for doing that, right? And so they are going to have to lower the penalties for selling to minors, but they can't say that in their ad campaign. They've got to say they're going to make it stricter. And so I think they're coming at it at that angle. They can't say, what I want to hear is, we're sorry for making marijuana illegal. It's a 100-year-old mistake. We're sorry we put everybody in jail. Actually, marijuana is pretty good, and we're going to legalize it. And if you went to jail, maybe the first bunch of money from marijuana taxes, we're going to help people who are punished. That's what I want to see. But they're saying marijuana is dangerous, it's harmful, and the best way to keep it away, this dangerous, harmful thing away from our kids, is to legalize it. And it's a weird argument, but they're making that argument because they want to diffuse the conservative argument who are saying it's dangerous and harmful. They want to go, yeah, we know it is. We agree with you. We want to protect people. So that's why they put a cop in charge. That's why they're framing it that way. But it's unfortunate because that formula doesn't lead to the right kind of legalization, right? Like, we want a legalization that's open, that recognizes that marijuana is essentially harmless and that it's prohibition that makes it more dangerous and all that kind of stuff. But that's probably not the kind of thing they're going to do. So we'll see what comes out of it. But I will say, I'm disappointed they haven't stopped arrests. That should happen right away. 25,000 or whatever it is, arrests for possession is 25,000 too many. But some of the rhetoric they're saying, I think, is good. Trudeau has said he supports personal cultivation, at least for medical use, and I hope they'll allow it for everybody. And they have also said that the price for legal marijuana has to be lower than the black market price, or else people aren't going to want to use it. And those are true things. How that'll come out, I don't know, but that's what I'm hoping they'll stick to that.
So yeah, with the price going down, do you think you'll ever see it at a farmer's market instead of a dispensary, like traditional growers?
Yeah, I think that the end result of legalization is going to be cannabis that is very, very cheap. If the whole world legalized marijuana and it was just entirely like any other